Okay, let's get going. So, where are we at this point? Our first big unbucketed topic. We've gone through sexual behavior, the behavior itself, what's going on in the brain acutely, what stimuli in the immediate environment are playing a role, the effects of hormones this morning, all of the above, brain structure that emerged in previous years to decades of your life, adolescence, childhood, and we have arrived. We still have more to do. We've come so far, yet we still have miles to walk before we sleep because we now have to look at what goes on during fetal life. What does fetal life have to do with sexual behavior, patterns of sexual identity, sexual orientation? And there's a ton of interesting stuff going on. First off, when we are talking about humans, we're talking about the prenatal period, but we're often talking instead about the perinatal period before birth and immediately afterward. Why is that? We humans are born proportionately more immature, more fetal than any other species. Standard deal is our heads are so big that we have to get born about 4 months earlier than we would if we were any other mammal, so that our heads can fit through mom's pelvic arch. And thus, humans right at birth are still fetalish. So, some of the things we're talking about that would be an entirely fetal prenatal phenomenon in other species is often perinatal in us, a little bit still going on afterward. So we start off by looking at hormones. And if we're looking at hormones during fetal life, we were looking at hormones this morning after breakfast. What we have here is a big dichotomy in endocrinology between what are called organizational effects of hormones and activational effects. Organizational effects, the effect of hormones on how your brain is being constructed during fetal life or immediately afterward. Activational, what sort of stimuli, what hormones will trigger whatever behaviors as a function of what sort of organizational effects there were during prenatal life. And all sorts of monkey experiments showing if you have this hormonal environment for a monkey prenatally, but then you manipulate a very different one, it doesn't have an effect unless this hormone is matched by this one there. So organizational versus activational. Very, very frequently used jargon in the field. So we look now at how the brain, the prenatal brain, goes about being sexually differentiated. And the main thing I want to emphasize here is I don't want to talk about it because, again, this is such a complicated topic and is miserably unexpected in its twists and turns and all sorts of hormones and testosterone getting turned into other hormones and having its effects that way, and it works totally differently if you're looking at a guinea pig or a monkey or us. So we're going to jump over the details of sexual differentiation to the fetal brain and emphasize just two take-home points about it. The first one is that there has been this sort of dogma in the field forever, way back when in my childhood, when I was learning about sexual differentiation of the brain, which is the default model. If you as a fetus secreted testosterone, you become a male. If you as a fetus didn't secrete testosterone, you became a female. Didn't matter what else you were secreting, you would, and here is the jargon, you would default into the female phenotype. So males is taking active endocrine sort of stimulation, and females is, whatever, you didn't do that. So I guess you're going to be a female. And that dogma has predictably gone by the wayside more recently, and it is a very active process of sexual differentiation of both sexes. And the fact that it is not a simple, you got this, you're male, you don't have this, you're female, is going to explain all sorts of interesting ways in which aspects of differentiation to the brain and body can dissociate. because it's not just a simple default model. The other thing that comes out of it is the key point that the body, everything that's not there, your body sexually differentiates early during fetal life. Your brain doesn't sexually differentiate until later on. That's interesting. What does that do? That opens up the possibility that there could be a mismatch between differentiation of the body and the brain because they're occurring at different times. We are going to see the implications of that shortly. Now, what those two pieces do, the fact that it's not just default, either you got testosterone or you don't, and that's all there is to it, and the very simple, ooh, your body differentiates at the same time. No, instead, active processes for differentiation of both sexes, with the body differentiating earlier in fetal life than the brain. What that helps to do is what I've hopefully already shown you strong evidence for, which is the binary model of sex differences in humans biologically just ain't so. And instead, you've got all sorts of versions of what's going on instead. So we have here what would be viewed as the old dogma of sex differences, how you get a girl and how you get a boy and what's going on there. First off, there's chromosomal sex. You are either XX or XY. That's it. The only flavors they come in. And that's all you need to know. Because depending on your chromosomal sex, that's going to determine your gonadal sex. Do you make ovaries or do you make testes? Binary, we're still doing just fine with binary, which then leads us to our next binary. Are you secreting androgenic hormones as a fetus? Or are you secreting estrogenic and progesterone-like hormones? And it's one or the other, and that's just continuing. You got XX versus XY here, which determines this, which determines this, which now determines what your genitals are going to look like. And there's your standard, like, Amazon fast delivery female and male genitalia, and it comes in two flavors, and that's what you've got. More challenges to binary, as we will see shortly. Secondary sexual characteristics. Once you got all this stuff going, then hormones are doing stuff to your like hair follicles and what's going to happen to you when you're like 12 and muscle mass and how deep your voice is going to be on the average. All of that. So all of that's occurring throughout the fetal body. And then, oh yeah, as the last step, let's get around to sexually differentiating the brain. Classic view, you start off with a binary chromosomal system, which determines which of these two, and which of these two, which of these two, which of these two, and so on. So what we focus on here is how that's not what happens at all. In every step along the way, there could be dissociation from all the other steps, and every step along the way could generate something that challenges the strict binary dichotomy. Starting at the chromosomal level, there's two types of humans. Yeah, they've got XX or XY. That is not the case at all. There's all sorts of, admittedly, very rare variants. XXY, XYY, XXX. So all of these come up. It doesn't come in just two flavors. And there are all sorts of interesting implications downstream of having one of these atypical sex chromosome makeup in your cells there in terms of what happens thereafter. Okay, so that isn't necessarily binary. Gonads, you either got ovaries or you got testes, but you can get stuff that's in between. One version of it is something called ovotesticular syndrome, where you have perfectly normal XX or perfectly normal XY or perfectly normal any of these, but the glitch occurs somewhere in this step, and you get somebody with a mosaic gonad. That's half ovarian tissue and half testicular tissue. Whether the person has a male or female external phenotype, that could pop up very rarely, but that could pop up. Then you've got something called 46XY Oh God, I can't remember that one either. You've got that one, and you get another version of the mosaic. You can get someone who is chromosomally male, as shown here, and they'll all have testes and a penis and all that sort of trappings, and in addition, they will have a uterus and fallopian tubes, both popping up. This can occur. Okay, next, on the endocrine level, there's not a strict dichotomy there either, and you've already heard the evidence for this, which is that women, female mammals of all sorts, secrete a certain amount of male sex hormones, androgens. We heard about this 2 days ago or 4 days ago. They don't come out of the ovaries, they come out of the adrenals, and there's not a ton of it, but there's enough of it, about 10% male levels. There's enough of it that has an effect on female sexual behavior. As we saw, these play a role in proceptive sexual behavior in women, sex drive, libido, that sort of thing. So that's not a clear split. Then we get into a really interesting world where you got two flavors of genitals coming in there falls apart. First version of it, first version as shown here, you have a daughter. You have a daughter. She is phenotypically a daughter. Everything looks perfectly daughter-ish and things are going fine. And when she's about 11 or something, first couple of kids in her class start having their periods and whatever. And 6 months later, a bunch more of the kids are having it, and your daughter hasn't yet, but whatever, variability. And she's 12 and she's 13 and she hasn't started getting her periods yet, and everybody else has, and this is hell for a pre-adolescent of please don't let me be any different from anyone else, and your daughter is lagging far behind. And you finally take her to a doctor who checks all sorts of things and eventually does sort of pelvic exams and such, and comes back with one of two possible answers, depending on which school of medical ethics you ascribe to. The first possible approach is the doctor sits down and says, you have a wonderful, beautiful, totally healthy daughter. It's just, unfortunately, she's never going to be able to have children. There's a reproductive problem up there, and that's why she hasn't started having her periods yet. Or you can give the more biologically honest explanation, which is, this daughter of yours, your daughter, is actually your son. This son of yours has XY chromosomes and has testes in there, usually way up in your son's sides there, undescended, has testosterone coming out the wazoo. Your son is secreting tons and tons of testosterone. What's going on here? And what we have is what is called androgen insensitivity syndrome. Also, perhaps more commonly known as testicular feminization syndrome. And what's happening there? Wait a second. You got XY, you've got testes, you got testosterone pouring out. What's going on? You got a mutation in the testosterone receptor, and it's not responding to it. And as a result, you have, in many ways, you get a female phenotype. And that is shocking to the parents, typically, and that is perfectly compatible with a life thereafter with a female identity, and it's just like some weirdo thing going on inside. But again, totally normal female genitals amid this picture of XY makeup because of the receptor problem. Now there's an even more interesting version of this, 5-alpha reductase. 5-alpha reductase is one of the enzymes that makes steroid hormones. All steroid hormones are made from cholesterol. They all are structurally similar. Don't try to write this down unless you care about biochemistry, but structurally they are all descendants of cholesterol. estrogens, progesterone, testosterone, glucocorticoids, mineralocorticoids, they're all structurally so they all have an intricately overlapping pathway of synthesis. And it happens, this enzyme, there's a mutation in it. And as a result, in males, very, very, very little testosterone is made and thus secreted. And what you get is a child born with a female phenotype exactly along all these lines in terms of genitalia, in terms of everything else you could commit, despite, well, no, in this case, very low testosterone, normal testes, normal XY, but a female phenotype because tiny amounts of testosterone are being made, not enough to have a masculinizing effect early in life. Okay, so you got a daughter, that's fine. And then along comes puberty when testosterone levels rise. And they finally rise enough, there's enough of the system still in place that, it's 1/5 of what it would have been. So you go from it being essentially undetectable to finally you get a little bit of a testosterone signal coming through puberty, and your child spontaneously changes sex, genital sex. So this must be pretty interesting. For my money, the most interesting thing about it is anthropological. This mutation has been found in two populations on Earth. One is a very isolated inbred population of people living up in the New Guinea highlands, and the other, a fairly isolated inbred population of people living up in the highlands in the Dominican Republic. And both of these cultures have a high incidence of this mutation. I'm making up a number here, 5%, 10%, who knows what, whatever it is, both cultures have that. And both cultures have accommodated it perfectly normally. You just, like, this is something that happens. You hit puberty, sometimes you get acne, sometimes you get a vagina, like who knows what. It's not a big deal. Total cultural accommodation to the subset of individuals falling into this category. So all these ways in which genitalia can look like one sex and actually be for the other, or even transition from one to the other. What is even more common is kids being born with some sort of ambiguity about their genitalia, sexual ambiguity, where it is not completely clear at the genital level what sex they are. And that turns out to be astonishingly common. Somebody of Brown, Anne Fausto Sterling, has spent her career looking at what are called intersexual genitally ambiguous individuals. And some people fight with her about her statistics and all of that, but she has come up with a number of how often is this happening for any of a variety of reasons. And what you get is a shocking conclusion, which is you pick a random street in America and walk down it past some people there, and the odds of you walking past somebody who was born with sexually ambiguous genitalia, the odds of that are greater than you walking past someone with an IQ of 150 or higher. Whoa, this is almost 2% of the population, according to Fausto Sterling's research on this. This is not, oh my God, incredibly rare. This is more common in society than having people up in that IQ range of the distribution. And what is normally done, most typically done, is some sort of plastic surgery to pick one phenotype. At that point, off you go. Okay, so we've got this determining all your secondary sexual characteristics, and all you need to do is look at the fact that muscle mass is on a continuum between the two sexes. Average thickness of the laryngeal something or others is on a continuum, all of that. There is zero instances of pure binary secondary sexual characteristics. So we see here all these ways in which the simple binary model from all of time has all sorts of exceptions to it. And in some ways, it then becomes a matter of taste. Is the conclusion from here is, whoa, this binary model doesn't hold? Or is the conclusion that, yeah, this is the basic model, the basic version is binary, but you get these weirdo rare exceptions so much that we can basically discount them and still say things are binary? For my 2 cents, anytime you're seeing something that's in almost 2% of the population, that's in the range where this is not just, oh, it's so rare, we really don't need to think about it. Oh, it's a footnote in all the endocrine textbooks, but this is really what's going on. At all these levels, particularly at this one, clear binary goes down the tubes. So we thus then get to the question of the last thing on our completely straightforward this causes this, as to what's going on with sexual differentiation of the brain. And the key point, as I said already, is the fact that the brain differentiates at a later stage of fetal life than all of these, so you can get a dissociation here as well. And what this now comes down to is, have people looked at the brains of trans individuals and cis individuals and seen if there's any differences? And the answer is, if you get enough big enough of a sample size and do statistics, on the average, yes, there are differences. The original conclusion of the field was due to the work of Dick Swab, that same guy, again, who got the first evidence for sexual dimorphism in the human brain. Swab did this classic study in the early 90s, like incredibly well researched and controlled for, looking at the brains of individuals who were either assigned male or female and spent their whole life happy with being male or female, versus people who had been assigned male or female, but trans their entire life, they have felt like they were the other one. And going through the brain, looking at his favorite spots in the hypothalamus, the bed nucleus, the striae terminalis, some of the most reliably dimorphic parts of the brain, what he saw in that first study was, if you are a trans individual who says, even though I was assigned this sex at birth, when you look in their brain of these areas, it's this profile. Whoa, that was a really striking finding, and that seems to give you a very simple punchline, which undoes all of the sort of conclusions before that. Old conclusions, you get some people now and then who are just all confused about what sex they are, and like, who knows this happens. This is suggesting something very different, which is, you get some people who are of a particular sex in their brain, and they simply have had the incredibly crappy luck of being handed the wrong body. And in that view, you come down to, well, this is somebody, for example, who's got the chromosomes, gonads, hormones, all of that of one sex, yet their brain is telling them they feel like the other. Not surprisingly, given what I do for a living, if I had to vote, listen to the brain every time. This is a picture of not people who are confused in their heads. This is pictures of a very certain clear-headed brain in there that's got stuck with the wrong body. In the years since then, that picture has been modified a bit as more studies have been done, still something resembling the exact same conclusion. When you look at a much larger number of the sexually dimorphic areas in the brain, what you see is some of them are clearly, completely of the size of the gender, the sex the person identifies with, rather than what were assigned. Some of them are in the middle, some are on a continuum, all of that. So you can no longer say, someone who says, even though I am A, I've always felt like a B. You can no longer say every dimorphic spot in their brain is going to look like a B. What you can say is, when you've got someone who was assigned sex A and they're saying, I feel like sex B, one thing you could be sure of is, when you look at the brain, it is not purely sex A. Good. More effects of prenatal environment. What's going on in terms of sexual orientation? Broadly, there's been models for gay men and for lesbians. Okay, gay men. Three classic models explanations for what fetal life has to do with adult sexual orientation afterward. The first one with men. The first one is the feminization model, that during fetal life, the brain fails to masculinize completely, and what you were left with is, notice, remnants of the default model. In the absence of a clear masculinization signal, you get default into a feminine something or other in the brain, which sets somebody up to be a gay male later on. Evidence for and against that. Evidence against it is the fact that, like, feminization of the brain and masculinization of the brain are by now two completely outdated concepts because it's a mosaic. We saw that before, all the different subparts and stuff. So it couldn't be as simple as the old model of, you don't get a masculine brain made when you're a fetus, you're going to be a gay guy. The other thing that does that in, as the complete explanation, and that there being some evidence for that, some evidence of decreased testosterone levels exposed to the fetus, that sort of thing, some evidence for that. For one thing, what it does have nothing to do with are the old classical stereotypes in Western cultures of gay men as having more feminized, stereotypical behavioral styles or whatever as being more feminine. And that was always the cliche, and that went down in flames very interestingly in the 1980s when AIDS broke out and people were dying in droves. And it suddenly became kind of important to find out something about sexual behavior among gay men, who to look at spread patterns and understand infectivity and all of that. And like a whole body of researchers went out for the first time and tried to get some data on this. First off, it produced some very interesting techniques in those ancient days where you had to say yes or no to a person asking you a question, where that was still laden with stigma of ways to randomize. You could get anonymity into it to make people more comfortable. But one of the things that came out of that is, on the average, in New York City or San Francisco or anywhere else you look at where there's any tolerance in the 1980s to open gay sexuality, when you look at it, gay guys are having way more sex than straight men. Gay guys, on the average, seem to have a much shorter refractory period. They lose their virginity at a much earlier age, and America's manly straight manhood looked at all those data coming out, and there went they're just all effeminate model down the drain in terms of just biological display of male typical sexual behavior. It's far more masculinized in your young male gay community, at least in San Francisco and New York. In the 80s, there were all sorts of cultural confounds, but nonetheless. So that one has some evidence for it, which we will see shortly. But what it certainly has nothing to do with is the death of the cliche of effeminate behavior in gay men, because that was totally done in by the findings about sexual patterns. Next possibility, there's evidence that prenatal stress has some effects on sexual orientation. At large amounts of stress, glucocorticoids being structurally like all those other steroids, as I was just saying, including androgens. If a fetus is inside a highly stressed mother, some of those glucocorticoids, instead of doing the normal thing and binding to glucocorticoid receptors, there could be spillover, and they get into testosterone receptors. Not enough to trigger anything, but enough to just gum up the works and thus demasculinize the fetus. A little bit of evidence for that. Increasing evidence for what's a really interesting model. And this is one where something people had long noted, people who devote their lives to studying something like this, had long noted that the more older brothers a man has, the more likely he is to be gay. Whoa, what is that about? And someone came up with a perfectly plausible theory, which is the more older brothers someone has, the more pregnancies their mother spent with a fetus in there of the opposite sex. The more such pregnancies with a male, the greater the likelihood at some point that her immune system is going to decide this male stuff is like this invasive sort of thing. That, oh no, it's happening again. All these signals of maleness coming to the immune system, and the immune system develops antibodies against aspects of testosterone endocrinology. And there turns out to be a lot of evidence for that. There's increasing amounts, and this one looks quite solid to the point where people have isolated anti-male antibodies in the bloodstreams of women who have had a whole bunch of sons. You've already heard that 4-2 finger bizarrety, and why that's the case, who knows, and why testosterone causes that, the male typical ratio, who knows, and why it's testosterone during fetal life, but right at birth, you can see individuals destined to be straight or gay already have a characteristic 4-2 ratio on the average, yet again, of their eventual sexual orientation. How about lesbians? What is known about prenatal environment? Overwhelmingly, clearly, it's a picture of endocrine androgenization. And this is demonstrated in two different literatures. The first one, this disease called congenital adrenal hyperplasia. There's some mutation, you're born with weirdo adrenals, and there's all sorts of problems with that. And among other things, what CAH causes is a massive increase in the amount of testosterone-like hormones, androgens, coming out of the adrenal glands. And what you see in CAH girls is a certain degree of masculinization of the genitals. When we get to the aggression lectures, we will see the original CAH literature suggesting that such girls were masculinized in terms of boy-like aggression and things like that. Turned out to be gibberish. But in terms of sexual orientation, CAH girls are more likely to wind up being lesbians. So that's cool. Two things that come up with that immediately. First off, if you are a CAH girl, there's something different about you than average, which is you're exposed to lots of adrenal androgens during fetal life. The other thing is you were probably going to be born with somewhat sexually ambiguous genitalia, meaning like your first 5 years of life, something, all sorts of surgeries are being done on you down there, and all sorts of people are interested in kind of what you got there, but a little bit gross out or weird about. You are not growing up, everything else being equal, except for what happened to you in fetal life. Your first half decade of life or so is often spent with a lot of medical procedures to sort that. That has to leave an imprint there in terms of one's psyche. The other thing is people in the endocrine field are slowly making progress in understanding the molecular mechanisms behind CAH. You get some more full-blown versions of CAH. You get cardiovascular problem, like it's a bad disease. You get the mildest versions, and you just get some problems with salt retention. But the overall goal of people in that field is to understand how can we prevent this disease that has a range of moderate to pretty severe downsides. And the gay community, the lesbian community, has been very attuned to what is between the lines here, which is as soon as they know how to cure someone, a fetus, of their CAH, are they actually curing them of their unwelcome sexual orientation later on? Is this, in a sense, a prenatal version of selective infanticide? So that one is controversial. The other one is a lot of women who have unstable miscarriages. There's a whole bunch of drugs now that could help stabilize that. But traditionally, starting in the 50s and thereafter, women were often given a progesterone-like medicine that also happened to have some androgenic type properties to decrease the likelihood of miscarriage. And women who were fetuses when their mothers were getting this, higher than expected incidence of winding up being a lesbian. And in this case, you are not getting born with any genital ambiguity, so that at least is controlled for. So that's the picture at the female end. Same thing as with the male end, flipped around now. Right at birth, fourth to second finger ratios are already indicative, are already reflecting a history of elevated androgen exposure. Okay, so fetal life, and now we cross that off and we are ready to leap into genes. And how do we know that genes have something to do with sexual behavior and sexual phenotype? XX chromosomes and XY chromosomes, those are genes. Oh yeah, that's right. That's part of the story. People have been getting a little bit more insight into stuff beyond something that crude. Some of it has to do with dopamine receptors. Dopamine, pleasure, reward, anticipation, motivation, all of that. And dopamine has a gazillion different types of receptors in different parts of the brain. And there's the dopamine D4 receptor. I think I might have mentioned this already. It's associated with an increased likelihood of ADHD, attentional issues, increased likelihood of impulse control issues, novelty seeking, sensation seeking, all of that. And you see that on the average in both sexes, people with the D4 variant that is most prone towards that sort of outcome have a profile on the average of earlier sex, more sexual partners, higher likelihood of unsafe sex and a sexually transmitted disease, more unstable relationships, and those studies again of how close do you stand to your partner and how close when you're in a stable relationship do you stand to somebody who is attractive, who is not your partner, and you see D4 status influences all of those things. Same thing going in some ways in the opposite direction with the gene for oxytocin and the gene for the oxytocin receptor. And what you see is among the variants, one of the less frequent kinds is one that produces a very high level of stability and fidelity in relationships, that sort of thing. So we see stuff being modulated there. Where you see our classic sort of interaction, our gene-environment interaction, comes through in a recent paper looking at genetic influences. This was a genome-wide survey of genetic influences on the age at which people lose their virginity. And what you saw was a particular massive screening profile, aggregate profile, that was associated with losing virginity at an earlier age. Except we're about to get, of course, one of our gene by environment. You only see this happening if the child is being raised in an unstable social environment. Then having that genetic profile is associated with earlier onset of puberty in a stable environment, no effect whatsoever, modulatory. What does a gene do? It depends on the environment. What does environment do? It depends on the gene. We know this drill by now, and this should be like a wildly familiar figure by now, because just flip it over, and that's the version of all the other interaction effects that we've seen. So, how about the genetics of sexual orientation? And here is where we enter some pretty bizarre socio-political realms, in that all along there's been two models of homophobia. One is it's a choice. They're choosing to be like that. The other is, oh, it's some sort of genetic abnormality. It's a mutation. And your prejudice could involve either of them, or for the really creative homophobes in the past, somehow they could simultaneously accommodate this being a genetically programmed trait that nonetheless is somehow still a choice. Okay, so the genetics of sexual orientation come laden with all sorts of political agenda, poisonous baggage, and that. All right, so what's known genetically about it? Our classic behavior genetic approaches, twin studies, adoption studies, suggest that there's some heritability to sexual orientation. Monozygotic twins, I believe the study showed about a 25% covariance in this trait. So that's there. How about coming into the modern era and actually being molecular? Jump into our molecular bucket after sneering at those primitive behavior geneticists who's found actual genes. And this is where there was another landmark study in the early 90s, about a year after Simon LeVay's study on sexual dimorphism in the brain. Out came a first paper in Science ostensibly isolating genetic markers for sexual orientation. Oh my God, you could bet every newspaper and broadcaster and whatever by that night was talking about scientists discover the gay gene. And this was once again interesting because if you were of the 1950s researcher generation interested in the genetics of orientation, that was yet another flavor of, ooh, what's genetically wrong with those people? This study did not land in that category of interpretation. Why? Because the scientist who had done the study, guy at National Institutes of Health named Dean Hammer, was, like LeVay, a very openly comfortable gay man who was an activist, and that was a much braver thing to be doing in the 1990s than sort of more recent ones before your times. This was a very different world. So in any case, he reported a genetic marker for sexual orientation. Whoa, that's like all he needs to do is figure out which the gene is. And people went wild over that, except for people who knew anything about genetics, saying it couldn't possibly be this clean. And soon it became clear that Hammer's finding was not particularly replicable, and other genetic markers would pop up with different subject populations. So there's not going to be a gene. There's not going to be a marker, of course, that is relevant to one's sexual orientation. Of course, since then have stepped in the folks doing the massive genome-wide association studies, and probably the best one ever done was published last year in Nature or Nature Human Behavior, I can't remember, and it did exactly all the great stuff you expect out of a study like that, which is they looked at the genomes and sexual orientation of almost 500,000 people, thanks to folks like 23andMe who share their data with researchers, almost 500,000 subjects, and looking at thousands and thousands, millions of places in the genome that show a lot of variability, seeing if something would pop up which was statistically significant, or if a cluster of sites would pop up that collectively were significantly predictive of someone's sexual orientation. And they found a genetic component to this. They found a marker profile and all of that. And exactly as you should expect by now with these studies, as we've heard, what you get is thousands, hundreds of thousands of little spots in the genome that wound up being relevant to one profile or the other. A gene determining sexual orientation, yeah, right, hundreds of thousands of spots of high variability that were predictive, and you put all of them together and you get the other problem in this field, which is collectively it explained 8 to 25% of the variability in sexual orientation. So modern genome-wide surveys, and you can go in and it's totally amazing what you find out, and you find out there's potentially hundreds, thousands of genes that are relevant. And you find out that collectively knowing about all of them put together still doesn't give you much predictability. Oh yeah, maybe those hundreds or thousands of genes not only work differently in different environments, but they interact with each other differently in different environments, and out emerge different properties as a result. Okay, at least amid that massive number of genes that were implicated. Did any of them say anything interesting? As per usual, most of them were completely mysterious. The ones that stood out at a higher than expected rate, one cluster had to do with olfactory receptors, and thus I think we are wandering back into the realm of pheromones, no matter how minimal of a role they're thought to play in humans. Another cluster has to do with male pattern baldness, so that somehow that comes into it. And another cluster was associated with immune competence, which there's a lot of sex differences. So that's the genetic literature. Genes have something to do with people's sexual behavior. Duh. These genetic effects are totally intertwined with environment, which should also be a duh by now. When it gets to the genetics of sexual orientation, there's evidence there is no gene for it. And one might ask at this point, how about sexual orientation in females? Anybody know about the genetics of that? And that field is lagging way behind, and that's an interesting question in and of itself. All right, so we jump over now, we jump to our next category, which is, what does culture have to do with sexual behavior? And yeah, that's got incredible amounts to do with it. And we've already seen much of that is manifested, or is most importantly, most foundationally manifested in how it affects how you were raised, because your mother will have the cultural attributes of the culture she was raised in, and all the way back to when it was invented, and that will include attitudes about sexual behavior, what's okay, what's not, what's beautiful, what's sinful, all. So culture is sneaking in massively through the back door here. Nonetheless, looking at it in this realm, there's an interesting, cool angle where different types of ecosystems produce different types of cultures. And here's one particular one, where did it go? It's on this side, that I find really interesting and charming here. I couldn't bring myself to erase this. I thought it was so wonderful from the emergence lecture. What you see is ecosystems. What sort of cultures do people invent if they're living in deserts versus rainforests? And it turns out you invent totally different profiles. And this is the profile for desert dwellers. First off, you are far more likely than chance to invent a monotheistic religion. Rainforest dwellers likely to be polytheistic. Monotheistic desert dwellers have swarmed out of the Middle East for the last thousands of years and conquered most of the rest of the planet. This is why our Earth is predominantly a Judeo-Christian Muslim culture, shared culture, rather than like a Kwakiutl or Trobriand Islander one. That monotheism, along with that, a lifestyle of pastoralism, which makes sense if you were in desert, semi-arid desert, any such thing. There's not a huge forest there for you to go get all sorts of plants and hunting animals and stuff. Hunter-gatherers, you are unlikely to be. It's a hell of a place to try to farm, and desert environments are highly likely to produce pastoralist people. People who wander the grasslands with their herds of goats and sheep and cows and camels and yaks. Yaks, people living in the far north of Asia, where it defaults in a sense to being a desert environment in terms of tundra everywhere you look, but pastoralism, nomadic cow people, sheep people. Wow, just like all those patriarchs in the Old Testament. What else do you see at a higher than expected rate in desert cultures? Polygamy. You don't see a high rate in rainforest dwellers. Polygamy. You also see higher than expected rates of 8-year-olds being married off to 60-year-old geezers and things like that. What you also see is what is termed a culture of honor, which is a system, a cultural set of values that's highly militaristic, that typically involves warrior classes, age groups who are designated as warriors for whatever number of years and spend most of their next 10 years raiding the neighbors to rustle their cattle or camels or defending you when they come back to do the same. You get a whole cultural mindset that the only appropriate response to any sort of insult is massive retaliation because you and your family and your ancestors and your descendants have been dishonored if you turn the other cheek. Vendettas, clan wars, feuds, all that sort of thing, and that's built into it. What you also see, and most relevant for us, is desert descended monotheistic pastoralist polygamists invent cultures that have the strictest strictures against whatever counts as non-conforming sexual behavior in that society. Like women getting some say as to who they marry, like women having something that defaults into being relationships outside of their marriage, things of that sort. Incredibly strong, harsh emphasis on female chastity, female fidelity, all of that. And that's a big feature of all of those cultures. And what are we describing? These are the cultures of, as being honor cultures, cultures of honor killings. A member of your extended family, a girl, a woman, has dishonored the whole family by something outrageous, like expressing that she doesn't want to marry the guy that she's about to be introduced to for the first time in her life. She runs away from it, anything like that. She expresses an alternative opinion, things like that. And what is horrifyingly common in cultures of honor like that are honor killings of your daughter, your sister, your niece. You and the entire family do it, because if you don't do it, she will have brought dishonor on your family. And one of the most interesting things out there is when you look at cultural groups, ethnic groups, so on, that have relatively recently come to the United States, as in the last few generations, things of that sort, how often people coming from desert pastoralist cultures are still carrying out honor killings in westernized countries, and some horrifying examples of that. In terms of culture of honor playing out in honor killings of boys, brothers, sons, all of that, yeah, exactly as you would guess, guys who are gay and act upon it. And that's where you get the same, not only tolerated killing, culturally celebrated. You go out and you and all your male relatives have just killed your daughter because she has done something as outrageous as living in an American suburb that you emigrated to, something as outrageous as talking to a boy after school. You wind up being celebrated in large parts of your community, the more conservative parts. Okay, final issue. Desert-derived cultures have invented two really interesting ways of mutilating the genitals of their children. Female genital mutilation, male genital mutilation. Let's look first at male genital mutilation, circumcision. Circumcision is an invention of desert cultures, of nomadic pastoralists, and there's a very logical reason for it, which is if you are of a tribe, a nomadic group, and you are constantly in the process of being nomadic, passing through areas of other groups, there's potentially the temptation to decide the grass is greener with those folks. You know what? I'm going to bail out on my folks and go join them and become one of them. And what male circumcision does is you're never going to pass there. There's no way you can ever convince those folks you're one of them instead of where you came from. It is a badge of identification. It is a green beard in a sense or so. And you see it in cultures where their challenge is not to recruit new members, but where their challenge is to retain current members, because you may be having a tough period wandering with your half-dead cows, and those folks appear to be doing much better. This male genital mutilation makes things much less likely to occur like that. Female genital mutilation is an outgrowth of this as well. When you have nomadic pastoralist cultures, what that means is there's times of year where the fields that are green are 10 miles away, and half the men in the village are out there with the cows or the camels or the sheep, whatever, where they're bivouacking there and they stay there for a month or two. There's periods where the men in relationships and couples there and stuff are away for a long period of time. And it's in those cultures that you have evolved clitorectomies, and the utility there is obvious, not because it keeps you from deciding you want to skip out and join another group. It's for making sure that you will not be getting any sexual pleasure and making infidelity that much less likely while the guy is away. It should be pointed out that has a seeming Western European equivalent, which is back when all sorts of guys were picking up and disappearing for years on end because they were off fighting the Crusades and getting Christendom, or at least slaughtering peasants. And during the Crusades started the myth that some of these upper class crusaders who would be gone for long periods invented chastity belts, and the overwhelming evidence is that was an urban myth of like crusaders back when. They never actually existed, or if they did, in tiny numbers. Okay, so we are now up to our last category, having gotten through culture and ecological influences: evolution. What does evolution have to do with sexual behavior? And the first thing starting off right off the bat is to ask the most basic question: why did we evolve sexual reproduction when the original version was asexual? It increases variability, and that turned out to be very adaptive for a subset of Earth's organisms that do sexual reproduction. So, now making sense of it. Why do we have sex? And it's obvious from everything we learned early on is to leave as many copies of your genes as possible until you get to humans and other species that have non-reproductive sex, and where you can't tell if somebody's ovulating. So it's obviously not for that. And for a while, there was a theory floating around that what sex is good for is social cohesion. It makes societies more cohesive. And this was put forward by this anthropologist, British, named Solly Zuckerman, who was this polymath who had influences in all sorts of fields. And his role in sort of the history of them is that he managed to be wrong in an amazing number of different disciplines. So he was the social cohesion hypothesis. Wow, people having sex makes everybody get along. You're right. It does very much the opposite in most cases. Unless you're a bonobo, sex is not a reliable mechanism for decreasing societal tensions, group tensions. It is often exactly the opposite. So, one of the main things that people focus on when looking at the evolution of sexual behavior, the starting point for all theorizing is a very simple fact: that unless you are a truly weirdo mammal, overwhelmingly, it is far more expensive to reproduce if you are a female than if you are a male. For males, it's basically you need a couple of sperm and you're in business. For females, it's the cost of pregnancy, which is enormous and often a major source of mortality. And even if you're in the most perfect pair-bonded relationship where you're splitting it evenly, it's still the cost of pregnancy and the cost of child rearing shared on top of that, or in tournament species pretty much alone, that females are facing a much, much bigger expense in order to pass on copies of their genes than males. And out of this comes the building block of all of this stuff, which is males don't have to be as picky as females, because all they need to pay for is a few sperm, and they're often the next county kind of thing, that this produces a basic asymmetry in the evolution of reproductive behavior. And where you see that pattern most dramatically is, of course, in tournament species. And where you see the least of it is with classic pair bonding species. Tournament species, especially in primates, what this gave rise to is what every primatologist believed in back when, what was called the linear access model of male mating, which is you get a whole bunch of male baboons, and there's number one in the hierarchy, and if there's one female who is an estrus that day, he gets the female. And if there's 2 females in estrus that day, numbers 1 and 2 males in the hierarchy get the females, and 3 and they get the females, and go on down the line with, of course, some sort of ranking of female desirability of that. And that is what everybody got raised in primatology all along, and we will see how that isn't quite so, but other realms in which sort of this plays out, just in terms of the cost of this, even in pair bonding species, even if a male does all of the child care, and that is approached in some of the South American pair bonded monkeys, females are still having to expend way more energy. Okay, so this sets us up, this basic asymmetry sets us up for making sense of male-male competition for reproductive access. And what that produces is the single most common cause of violence and killing, interpersonal violence on this planet, no matter what primate you are looking at, which is one male killing another male, either over direct or indirect competition for access to a female. Universal, every culture looked at, that is near the top of the list. What is second typically on the list are men doing violent things, homicidal things to women built over suspicion of infidelity or rejection, not having your desires filled. So male-male competition, an enormous percentage of it is built around this sort of thing, and this generates, obviously, the linear access model. If the deal is, if there's only one female who's fertile, you want to mate with her, you want to be alpha, and if there's can't be that, you want to be beta, and thus we get ostensibly the whole driving force on male-male competition and formation of hierarchies, because it pays off reproductively. We already know another domain of male-male reproductive competition. Back oh so many weeks, sperm competition. Sperm trying to poison each other, sperm cooperating with sperm from closer relatives to try to outrace stranger sperm, all of that, so that's another domain. Another domain is alternative strategies, a concept that has become very, very well studied, especially in primate behavior. Alternative male strategies, rather than overtly competing for high rank in the male hierarchy, after which linear access is going to explain everything about the genes you pass on. Alternative strategies. You see alternative strategies in like fish species where there's a single breeding dominant male, and some other male will change phenotype, will look like a female, but actually be a male and can hide out there and subterfuge that way. We are going to see a very interesting alternative male strategy among primates shortly. But what this brings us to is one of the alternative strategies, just the dramatic foreshadowing of what I just referred to as another option with primates that we'll see about, is to be a nice guy and work on male-female affiliation instead of male-male competition. We will get to that. Another alternative strategy is one that is not heartwarming, which is coercive sex. Are we the only species that shows that? And that is not the case. And there's all sorts of horrible anthropomorphizing crap that came out in the literature. Mallard ducks will occasionally have coercive sex in females. So, aha, the mallard duck model for why rape is deeply embedded in the human evolutionary history, garbage like that. It only even makes sense to talk about in the context, at least, of other primates. 2 examples. The first one from my baboons, and over the course of 30 plus seasons watching them, on only 2 occasions did I see something which someone may initially say you're anthropomorphizing, something that looked like rape. Something that I think fit the exact definition of it, in that it was a male attempting to mate with a female who was not an estrus, who tried to fight him off, who tried to run away, who was very convincingly pained like hell when she was penetrated. And I've seen that only twice, And it was the same circumstance. On the day that an alpha male has been toppled from his alpha position, he goes and does that to one of the females. Incredibly rare, nonetheless, the fact that both of those were that, telling you rape is power, rape is displacement. Even a baboon male would know that that was not about passing on copies of his genes. And then we get to the very troubling picture of orangutans. Old model of orangutans. You get a bunch of orangs in your zoo enclosure or whatever, and there's this one big dominant male, and he's got all this secondary sexual characteristic stuff, and he's unmissable, and he's totally dominating all these young squirrely males who are all like these immature guys that haven't even matured yet. And then you notice something interesting. You take like a 10-year vacation and you come back to see the orangs, and still the same big alpha male, and it's still the same little squirrely juvenile males that he's bossing around. Wait a second, they can't still be juveniles. They're 10 years older. And out of that formed the model that there are two male orangutan morphs. There's the dominant one who has all the secondary sexual characteristics and dominates mating and all of that and stresses the hell out of the subordinates, who are stressed so much that they go into what was termed arrested development. They don't hit puberty because they're stressed out of their minds from this big guy that they never get the endocrine profile for that, all of that. And seemingly voting for that is at some point the alpha male dies or he gets sent off to a zoo on the other side of the world or so. And the highest ranking of the rest of these little juveniles over the course of the next few months suddenly turns into a big secondarily sexual male with all the flanges and 3 times the body weight and long hair and all of that. As soon as the spot opens up, the highest ranking of these, frozen and in pre-puberty hassle traumatized males now turns into a high-ranking one. And it turns out that's not the case at all. And this was research that came out over the last few decades looking at hormone levels in these guys. And what would be your prediction with the old model, these squirrely little guys who were prepubescent for hundreds of years and all of that? They're going to have very low levels of testosterone and very high levels of glucocorticoids, stress hormones. And what turned out is you see exactly the opposite. They are fully mature in terms of sex hormone levels, and they are making plenty of sperm and all of that, and they don't have particularly elevated stress hormone levels. This is not them being stressed into being infertile and never hitting puberty. This is an alternative strategy. An alternative strategy where they are much less conspicuous going about having sex. This is where the heartwarming totally disappears. What is the alternative strategy? Something that by human definition and by baboon definition from a few minutes ago counts as rape. These arrested development, not really arrested development males have significantly high rates of coercively having sex with females and that increasing their reproductive success. So that's part of the landscape. Male-male competition, and especially in species where all you have to do is pay a couple of sperm, and alternative strategies, more and more appreciated. What about female-female sexual competition? And where you see it predictably, of course, is in pair bonding species. If, like, all you're getting from your tournament species guy is some sperm and somebody else can get it, what you're getting in a mate in a pair bonded species is a guy who's going to stick around and do at least half the childcare and stuff. And you spot someone who is a prince in that regard, and that's where you get high levels of female-female aggression, competition for paternally competent males. So a very different picture there. Now, amid this, out came a major revolution in primatology, and this was triggered by Sarah Hrdy, the person who first discovered competitive infanticide. And what did she report? When you look at the data, The linear access models made no sense at all. There was no evidence to support them. It was not the case that the alpha had the highest reproductive success, next in line, next in line, next in line, as people began to do things like figure out paternity from blood samples, urine samples, things like that. The linear access model wasn't actually occurring. What you were having instead was a very different profile of which males were passing on their genes, and she introduced this Bolshevik crazy notion that females have some choice in the matter. And female choice became a trendy topic, a trendy term at that point, because you would see that females did have some degree of control. Baboons, a male baboon is like 3 times the weight of a female, 2 to 3, it's got gigantic canines, all of that. Where does female choice come in? So that male is in a consortship with a female who wants nothing to do with this lunk, and he's like walking right behind her the entire day. What does she do? She doesn't cooperate. When he tries to mate and mount her, she walks away. When he starts foraging and he figures there's a time for a picnic, she picks up and goes, and he's got to like scramble to catch up with her. They just wear down the males. And with a certain frequency, the guy walks away and gives up the consortship because it's too much of a drag. With a certain frequency, the male instead gets frustrated enough that he attacks the female, where the risks of death is coming in. But assume this is the one where the male moves off, whatever next male in the hierarchy is there, he's now going to come in. Here's something females really do when they're good at this female choice stuff. They don't just keep on the move all the time, so this poor guy is like half dead and starving. What they do is they keep walking right over to one of the main competitors of the male they're stuck with. Have them walk right past them, things like that, to generate levels of tension, enormous tension. And what's likely to happen then? The 2 males get into a fight where they go chasing each other around a quarter mile of stuff, and they spend the next 15 minutes busy with it. And what does the female do? She runs off to the bushes and mates with the guy who she actually wants to mate with. That's where you get it. And stolen copulations is only one of the many, most of them too foul to use jargon for, when females manage to get their guy off fighting with another one and they run to the bushes. So now we get this critical question: what do female baboons want when they can go and hook up with anyone in the bushes, and who is it that they want? And here's where we get the truly radical finding that is so surprising and counterintuitive that nobody could have imagined this. Who do females choose to mate with? Nice guys. Nice guys. Guys who they have a grooming relationship from over the years. Someone who may have fathered their previous kid and is like kind of nice to the kid every now and then, will carry the kid around. Nice guys, males who do not do a whole bunch of displacement aggression. That's who they want to wind up with. Can you believe how wonderful this is? Nice guys not finishing last. And it turns out a significant percentage of matings and births among baboons involve a female winding up with the nice guy, the not so platonic, just friends relationship after all, but the grooming with benefits version. So that's an alternative strategy to females by which she manages to get some control. Another version of some control: species in which females can store away sperm, can sequester sperm from different males in different compartments, and then, in a sense, physiologically, compare them and dump the sperm that are not optimal and go with the guy who has better sperm by whatever standard. Snakes do this. They do sperm storage and sperm dumping from multiple different males. So, input from females in that regard. Okay, this now brings us to our next issue of the evolution of sexual behavior: monogamy. Monogamy, from the very first in this, we're dealing with pair bonding species versus tournament species. And when you look at all the social species out there, monogamy is far and away the rarer one. And when you look at zoologically, taxonomically, where monogamy pops up, it's not one cluster of one related species. It has popped up independently over and over in various places. What are the driving forces for the evolution of monogamy? The main one, the one for which there's the best evidence, and this is the work of this guy named Cluttenbrock. That's actually his last name. He's one of these hyphenated Brits at Oxford, and he is at Oxford, Tim Cluttenbrock, who sort of showed that monogamy is mostly likely to arise in ecosystems where resources are patchy and widely distributed. What does that mean? A female will have to settle in around one of these resources and another female around another, and they're too far apart for one male to try to do the tournament species nonsense of sort of accessing all of them, and out of that evolves monogamy. Another version, it evolved out of some mutation in vasopressin and oxytocin related genes. Another finding for which there's evidence is the notion that monogamy evolved in species that previously had high rates of male infanticide. The male sticks around to try to protect the kid. So, some logical, ecological, social structural reasons why monogamy has evolved fairly rarely across social species and stuff. And once again, that emphasis from 2 days ago that in pair bonding species, there's potentially a world of difference between sexual monogamy and social monogamy. And what you see again in voles, even those wonderful prairie voles singing heartwarming from the grasslands about the wonders of monogamy, prairie vole pair bonding is very, very powerfully socially monogamous. Sexually monogamous, maybe not as much. There is male extra pair matings on some occasions there. So the contrast between the two. So, of course, we now get to the critical question, like, what's up with humans? And we already know the answer to that in terms of monogamy. By every measure we looked at all these weeks back, humans are neither a classic tournament species or a classic pair bonding species. In terms of size difference between the sexes, differences in lifespan, muscle mass, metabolic demands, lung capacity, sperm count in human males versus primate pair bonders or primate tournament, by every regard, we are right in the middle. We are right in the middle with a lot of variability going on there. And I think this explains all sorts of intensely confusing things about human sexual behavior. As follows, the majority of cultures on this planet allow polygamy. Nonetheless, the majority of men in polygamous cultures are in monogamous marriages. What's that about? This is one of two types of monogamy that emerges. One of two types of polygamy that emerges. Economic polygamy, where the males who are polygamous in this society are the ones who are the wealthier ones, higher status, and they can more cows that they can use to buy a new wife and that sort of thing. Economic or demographic polygamy. This is a culture of honor population where, like, a lot of the guys get killed fighting during the warrior stage and there's a shortage of men. It's in the economic polygamous societies that you see they're the most common form of polygamy, where nonetheless most of the men in those societies are in monogamous relationships, and nonetheless most of those guys would happily be polygamous if they could afford to do so. Then we look at Western populations, 50% divorce rates, which nonetheless are not made up of 50% of people who get divorced instead of serial divorcers. And we've got all the cultural stuff where we applaud monogamy in your 100th wedding anniversary while being irresistibly pulled to all the exceptions to that and the gossip pages and stuff. And all they were exploring with extramarital relationships and ethical extramarital relationships and polyamory and all these new trendy things. Humans are right in the middle, confused as hell, with nothing consistent. Okay, how about the evolution of sexual orientation? A hell of a lot more thinking and research has gone into male issues of sexual orientation than females, but what's known about males is dealing with like a major puzzle. In society after society, with or without hideous amounts of discrimination, persecution, all of that, on the average, gay men leave fewer copies of their genes. There's a subset historically of gay men who were closeted and had kids and all of that, but overall, gay men leave fewer copies of their genes than do their brothers. That is the cleanest comparison we can make. Whoa, by all the rules of Darwin, then this is maladaptive. Why is this persistent? Why is this in every culture on Earth and roughly the same incidence, even in the face of horrible persecution, all that? Why is it still sticking around if it's maladaptive? Two arguments, two bits of evidence supporting it. The first one is the getting back to, I think we've already talked about this, insofar as you're talking about evolution of sexual orientation, you've just committed yourself to genes having at least something to do with it. And this is the whole notion of full expression of genetic traits, homozygosity, versus partial expression, heterozygosity. And we've just seen a whole bunch of cases in human genetics where the full-blown version is adverse, but there's a reproductive advantage to the heterozygotic partial form. And in this version, if so far as there's genes driving it, the full-blown homozygotic version of sexual orientation genes causes very decreased reproductive success, but the advantages, the heterozygotic advantages, are so wonderful for the close relatives that that outweighs the deleterious consequences of the homozygotic version. Some evidence for this. The siblings of gay men, for example, have higher reproductive successes, not only than their gay brother, but of the population in general. There's some sort of boost that happens there. Another feature of that boost could very well be economic rather than genetic, and this is referred to as the helper at the nest syndrome. The rich uncle, the uncle who has lots of money and is not spending it on any kids and winds up spending it on the nieces and nephews, kin selection of their siblings. And what the studies show is, in terms of who money is bequeathed to, on the average, gay uncles leave much more money in their wills to kids than straight uncles do. So that as a potentially source of benefit there. Okay, so all of this leads us now to, in some ways, the final, most demanding question, which we're only going to be able to start here and not finish, which is, so all of this factored in, what is the evolution of attractiveness? Who do we find to be attractive? Who do we social mammals, we social primates, we humans of this sex or that sex, of this orientation or that, what is the basis of attraction? And the first thing to get into is an area of profound screwed up confusion, just as like the insular cortex confuses gustatory disgust with moral disgust, all of that. Another part of the brain, a frontal cortical area, has something to do with confusing internal beauty and external beauty. External attractiveness, and once we invented concepts like people like having good souls or whatever version you came up with, a confusion between the two, a yoking of the two, and like every Victorian writer back there was talking about how external beauty is a reflection of your internal beauty. Your brain has a lot of problems distinguishing between good acts and good looks. And this comes through in imaging studies, for example, where you got somebody in the scanner, either sex, and what they're doing is looking at pictures of people and rating how attractive they seem, and then reading a paragraph about something or other that somebody did and rating how moral or immoral it was, and now a picture alternating back and forth. And what was shown was a considerable amount of overlap as to which areas of the brain activated. When we are assessing the beauty of moral behavior and the beauty of faces, we are using a lot of the same neural circuitry, and it is easy to confuse the two. And before you know it, you are treating somebody way better than you would have by chance because they're attractive, or more likely to hire them, or more likely to quit them, or that whole world of confounds. So the first thing that has to be remembered when looking at the evolution of attraction is that by the time it gets to us, it is confused in the brain with all sorts of other things. Good. So, at the top of the list of what social species look for in a mate is something that nobody anticipated, see, bizarre as hell, which is symmetry. Symmetry of the face, symmetry of the body. Every species out there, I believe, like Drosophila, even all of that, incredibly widespread. How was this discovered? This was a criminologist in the 19th century, Lombroso, criminologist, who decided that he understood criminology enough he could determine, he could predict it in two ways. One was whether the person had bumps on their head of a certain pattern, phrenology. The other is, whoa, all of those criminals kind of have those same criminal faces. I could tell if somebody's criminal or not just by looking at their face. Why don't I teach the world what a criminal face, a composite criminal face looks like? And he did this very clever thing. He had pictures of different criminals being arraigned and all of that, and they were put on sheets of glass and superimposed them, some like ancient pre-Photoshop sort of thing. And when all the faces were overlapped, what his plan was is you could see out of that would come a composite face. This is the face of a criminal. This is how you recognize them. And that's not what happened. None of that appeared to be the case. Instead, what you got was everybody saying, huh, that's like that composite face. That's kind of a good looking guy. And since then, what people have learned is when you make composites of faces, when you average them out over a whole bunch of faces, the composite face is consistently rated as more attractive than any of the individual ones. What is that phenomenon about? Compositing, averaging out facial features, make them symmetrical. What is asymmetry a marker of? Back to this photograph from beginning of the course, asymmetry. Asymmetry is a marker of poor health. Asymmetry is a marker of a history of injuries and infestations and all of that. Symmetry is sort of one of the markers of a very healthy body, and that's something that people find attractive. That's something that goats find attractive. That's something. Symmetry is a hugely influencing factor in mate attraction. And you see that manifested in all sorts of cool studies now where you could subtly manipulate pictures and stuff, but this is something that's been known for like more than a century. So symmetry. What next? What next? You will have to hold on to your seats and wait till Monday to find out what's next when we continue this, finishing up this whole section before we move on to aggression and counters to aggression.